praise to Manjushri, this wonderful prayer that is about aligning ourselves with the Buddha of wisdom and trying to invoke that type of energy so that we can accomplish the same realizations and realize emptiness, help others to do the same. So this praise to Manjushri, Bob will get that up on the screen, and then we'll recite that together. Again, when we get to the mantra, we recite the mantra 21 times, and then on a single breath, try to do 108 times of the syllable D, and then swallow at the very end, kind of bringing that wisdom energy into your mind. So, okay. So we'll go a few pages down to the praise. This is the Heart Sutra, yeah. Great. There we go. Thanks, Bob. Homage to my Lama and protector, Venerable Manjushri, who holds at his heart a scripture symbolic of his seeing all as it is, whose pure genius shines like the sun unclouded by the two obscurations, who, with compassion like a father for his only child, teaches with 60-fold eloquence all beings imprisoned in cyclic existence, groping in the darkness of ignorance and overwhelmed by suffering. You, whose thunder-like proclamation of the perfection of wisdom arouses us from the stupor of our afflictions and frees us from the iron chains of karma, who wields wisdom's sword, vanquishing the darkness of ignorance, hewing down our every sprout of suffering. You who are primordially pure, gone to the end of the 10 grounds, complete embodiment of every excellence, whose princely body is graced with the 112 adornments, O Manjushri, to you I bow, dispel the darkness of my mind. Om Arapatsanadi, 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 Patsanadi, Amara Patsanadi, Amara Patsanadi, Amara Patsanadi, Amara Patsanadi, Amara Patsanadi, Omara Patsanadi. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness of my mind's confusion. Grant me the light of self-assured intelligence, that I may see into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. Then we'll do a short mandala offering, symbolic of offering this vast, pure, visualized realm as kind of our own future enlightenment in a purified state, all of what we can imagine sending out as an offering to the Buddhas, to our gurus, so that we can receive their blessings and inspiration and become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge and bodhicitta, these two thoughts in the first one in the first 2 lines, taking refuge, finding safe direction in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then the last 2 lines, cultivating the motivation of bodhicitta. And we'll do a short reflection on that as well in the meditation. Let's do this once in English and twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chönyen gi pe sanam gi Dola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay. Thank you, Bob. Let's do a short meditation then, as we usually do, just to focus the mind a bit, and then to set motivation of bodhicitta. So spend the first few minutes in silence, meditating on the breath, however you prefer to do that. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to reestablish our motivation of bodhicitta for tonight. So I'll ring the bell to begin the meditation. So now let's set our motivation for this evening's class. And as we've been going through this course, we've been working with this idea that there are two sorts of ways we can approach emptiness we've looked at so far. One is to understand dependent arising, to see that things still do exist. They have a dependent nature, so they lack any independent status. But they do exist, albeit in a very, very subtle way, only through nominal existence. And then the other side is where we actually go in and disprove the idea that things could have any sort of inherent or independent existence, through coming to see that that is not findable, that we cannot actually locate something that verifies that misconception, that object that we're holding so tightly through our ignorance. We cannot find it to exist at all. So we're always trying to hold these two awarenesses together to find this perfect middle way. And even when we're setting our motivation, it's important that we work in the space of that middle way. recognizing that while we ourselves are turning our attention towards our future enlightenment, towards the path that leads to that, generating the motivation of being a benefit to all beings, all of those things only exist in a nominal way, only merely imputed, merely designated. And that is completely complementary to their emptiness, their lack of inherent existence. That I myself do not have an atom of inherent existence. My actions of practicing the path and dedicating myself to achieving enlightenment, that these lack inherent existence. And the goal that I'm striving for, achieving Buddhahood, so I can then benefit all beings. Again, all of this lacking inherent existence, completely empty, but still existing, and albeit very slight, things being merely imputed, merely designated. So within the space of these two thoughts, we can find the perfect way to even set our motivation is to hold that awareness, not concretizing ourselves and concretizing the goal and the path and so on, but rather acknowledging that we can bring this wisdom to bear even as we set our motivation. That things are illusory, they're dreamlike, not existing inherently, but nonetheless, everything's still functioning. Therefore, we can attain enlightenment, and it is within emptiness that we actually can accomplish that goal. If things did exist inherently, independently, we could never progress to enlightenment. We haven't encountered this verse, but there's a verse I'm paraphrasing a bit from Nagarjuna that says, for the person for whom emptiness makes sense, everything makes sense. Everything is feasible. For the person for whom emptiness does not make sense, nothing is feasible. Nothing makes sense. So try to bring to bear your own understanding of emptiness as we set our motivation, thinking that this I that is merely imputed wants to practice the path to enlightenment, which is merely imputed, to attain the goal of Buddhahood, which is merely imputed. So I can benefit all sentient beings who also are merely imputed, completely empty of any inherent existence. And in this way, we're already kind of uniting these two thoughts of compassion and wisdom in this moment. So we'll actually get to a bit more of this idea of compassion and emptiness, how these two fit together in next week's class and the final class in this series. In terms of where we're at, we've been working on the whole idea of realizing the selflessness of the person, especially the I. Selflessness of persons applies to the emptiness of all people, all beings. But obviously, we don't need to realize that as strongly with regard to someone else. We need to realize it with regard to ourselves, because again, the whole show is rotating around the strong grasping that we have at the sense of I that is totally inflated, totally exaggerated, not an atom of inherent existence. So in the last class, we went through initially the 4-point analysis and kind of reviewed that a little bit. I had introduced it at the end of the previous class. Let me go ahead and share the slides I put together for this just so we can have that visual to go along with what I'm saying. So get the slideshow started. And again, this is the third topic we're in. Today we will go on to investigating the self of phenomena after we talk a little bit more about the self of persons. And then in the final class, I want to go through the analogies for contemplation that come from the Vajrakuta Sutra, and then talk a bit about, again, compassion and emptiness and how these two sort of fit together so that we come back around to that the method side of the path, the desire to attain enlightenment and so on, and how emptiness completely fits into that. So the 4-point analysis that we looked at, again, we are usually doing this with regard to the I that is in our own continuum, the I that is merely imputed, but that we inflate and impute a self, again, that is that it is lacking. That mere I doesn't have any of that, but we need to first identify the object of negation, this exaggerated sense of self that we are putting on top of that mere I. The sense of an inherently existent I, substantially existent, objectively existent, existing from its own side, all these things that we've looked at previously. We have to first get clear about what that is. We do that through bringing to mind, especially a time when we had very strong emotions. Being falsely accused is a good one, or when we felt our life somewhat in danger, not to relive that emotion, but to feel what the I is like at that point, which seems to have, again, its own inherent identity, existing very strongly, concretely, substantially. Then we determine the possibilities for finding something that is that I, for determining what exactly is the referent of that conception. If that conception is true, then it must have a true referent. It must have something it's referring to that we can locate. If it's false, then we won't find it. So the possibilities are that that is identifiable as equivalent to something within the mind-body complex or the collection of the mind-body, what have you, or it's going to be completely different. So we end up with these two options of oneness or difference. Either it is one with all of this, or it is completely different from the mind-body complex. So then we analyze in both of those ways, and this is a very general analysis that we do, and at this stage we don't go into the deeper points that we went into last week in terms of the five-fold analysis and what we're going to review briefly tonight, which is the seven-fold analysis of Chandrakirti. But we essentially look for something that the consequences of it being the same, identical to the mind-body complex, and there are, of course, a number of those. We don't need to go through all of those again tonight. And then look at the consequences if it is completely different. Well, then you'd have this unrelatedly I with the mind body having its own experience. So again, we have consequences that follow from this. There's also the meditation that I encourage you to take a look at that's more about doing the actual investigation. Can you find some part of the mind body complex or even the totality of the mind body complex to be equivalent to that I in all ways, meaning it has to be unitary, meaning it has to have, again, that same sense of I that we are trying to locate. It has to be embodying all of that, standing on its own, identifying itself. Well, just the fact that we have a basis for that I, and then the I that is thought of in reference to that, speaks to the fact that they can't be the same. They have to be different to some degree. But again, if we have utter difference where they are completely different and unrelatedly different, which would mean that they're inherently different, well, then we'd have consequences of that too. As I was saying earlier, the mind body would have its own experience while the I was having a completely different experience. So we looked at that, and hopefully you've had a chance to work with that analysis. Then we looked at this verse that is in your folder, your booklet on the top of page 8. This comes from Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. Neither the aggregates nor different from the aggregates. The aggregates are not in him, meaning the Tathagata here, because it's the Buddha that they're analyzing, nor is the Buddha, the Tathagata, in the aggregates. The Tathagata does not possess the aggregates. So what is the Tathagata? Can you find an inherently existent Tathagata in any of these five ways? So essentially what this is this is what you would replace the third and fourth step with. You would do your initial bringing to mind the object of negation, and then you would determine that we essentially are still dealing with the same idea of sameness or difference, oneness or difference, and then you go through these more detailed ways of looking at it, which again, we saw that these are divided in this way. This was another slide I showed last week. Sameness refers to, again, just the basic comment that the person is not inherently the same as the aggregates. And then the fifth one that was mentioned in that verse, which was possessing the aggregates. We saw that there were two means of possessing. One was possessing like somebody possessing something within their own continuum, so then we would have that kind of a possession, sameness of entity, like in the way I possess an ear or possess my nose or whatever the case might be. Then we had difference in terms of the first that is very similar to what we saw in the 4-point analysis, that the person cannot be inherently different from the aggregates. We would analyze for that. And then we had the third, the fourth, and then the second part of the fifth, that the person does not inherently depend on the aggregates, and the aggregates do not inherently depend on the person. Remember the two analogies there of like the lion in the forest, and the forest being the aggregates, the lion being the self, and then the snow covering the forest, which is like the self or the I, and the aggregates are the forest that's underneath that kind of depend upon that. So again, these are also impossible ways of the inherently existent I existing, because they are a form of difference. It's just they have a slightly different flavor to it. And again, we might examine our own thinking and see, does it fit along these lines? When we think about this strong sense of an I, does it seem like there's a person kind of in there among the aggregates? It sort of depends upon them. Or is it the sense that there's a person that completely covers the aggregates, that is like the snow covering the forest? And then the last point under difference was the second part of the fifth, where you have possession, but it's possession in terms of something being different in entity, like Devadatta possessing, a cow or something. So the cow is completely different than Devadatta. So rather than Devadatta possessing his ear or his, head or whatever the case might be, there is where it's within some, same entity. So these were the points that were raised by Nagarjuna in terms of his fivefold analysis. Let me see real quickly if there are any questions up to this point, because again, at the end of last class, I introduced in the briefest way the sevenfold analysis, because I didn't even go into the two additional points. But I just wanted to make sure everyone is kind of clear about what we talked about last time. And yeah, Doris.
I'm not familiar with the Davida cow.
Devadatta.
Devadatta,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's all right.
I'm that unfamiliar.
Yeah. So again, when we talk about possession, like if we say that the I or the self possesses the aggregates, well, then we have to decide two forms of possession that can happen. One is like let's not even use Devadatta and the cow. Let's just talk about me and my little wrist mala that I like to use. So I have my wrist mala and me possessing it. These are two different entities, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like if I say that I possess the aggregates, so then the aggregates would be completely different, and I'm the one possessing the aggregates. But again, that would be one way that we could look at it. But we don't really have that idea again with the aggregates. I don't think the aggregates are completely apart from ourselves, right? I mean, so that one's not as likely, but nonetheless, we have to explore that as a possibility. Is there an I that possesses the aggregates? Well, we do sometimes think that way, right? We do have the idea of my body and my mind. Well, where is this inherently existent I that possesses something that is completely other than ourselves? That we can have that kind of objective reference to. But then we can also have a sense of possessing, which again is like Devadatta and his, ears or something. I can say, I possess my ears. I have my ears. Well, then my ears are part of the continuum of the basis of that. So in that case, if I look at the aggregates, and I would say that it's a similar type of thing, where I think that the aggregates are within the continuum of that I, but are possessed by an I, which still has some sense of difference. Or I'm sorry, that has some sense of sameness, because the sameness would be that even though I'm only isolating some part of the being or the basis of the being in terms of ears or eyes or what have you, the idea is that that's a way of possessing, that I'm possessing something within my own continuum. So these are the two flavors to possession. So possession can be possessing something that's completely other than oneself, or possessing something that is within the basis for oneself. And again, we might have that thought on occasion too, I would imagine, that we don't necessarily feel that complete distance from the body when we think my body. You can think my body as something completely separate from you, but that might be a bit bizarre. But we can think of my body as being something within our continuum that we are possessing, but nonetheless, it's not completely equivalent. We can do the same analysis and find that they can't be utterly the same, inherently the same, or else just that would refer to the entirety of the self. There'd be no thing that could ever be referred to as the self outside of that. Because again, what we're trying to locate in these analyses is this true referent, as I mentioned earlier, the true referent of this inherently existent I, meaning that if it exists, you have to find something that is it. If it's existing inherently from its own side, self-established, well, then that means something is there that is it, something you can point to. And what's interesting is all the lower Buddhist schools say there is something that is the I.
Mm.
Some of them point to like our mental consciousness as being the I. We talked about this a little bit earlier, right? How consciousness is probably one of the trickiest ones to work with, because there is that thread of consciousness that goes through all of our lives. That, consciousness, the grosser levels arise sort of around it, but there's a sort of core of clear light mind that goes through all of our lives. Well, somebody might say, well, then that's the self. That's the real self. But then it has to be equivalent in all ways. We could never identify ourselves with as the body. We could never identify ourselves as our grosser levels of consciousness. We would have a lot of other errors that would ensue if we said that only that is equivalent to the inherently existent I. Because it would have to be, again, inherently one with it. There would be nothing else that would be it. So this is the idea behind this possession. Maybe I've gone a little beyond that question, but
No.
does that help a little bit? Or
Oh, absolutely. Thank you
okay.
very much. Thank
So
you.
we're gonna. You're welcome. Thanks for the question. We're going to see this repeated in Chandrakirti's analysis, because essentially he takes those same 5 points that Nagarjuna raises and he just adds 2 more to them. Another way of seeing. Well, actually, let me just see if there are other questions, and then I can go on to what I was going to talk about. Any other questions? Did you get a chance to do this analysis at all? There's not really a formal written up meditation on just the 5-fold, but it's within the 7-fold. So you can kind of get, practice with it by using what we had for the 7-fold. Recall again that we had that 2 meditations that Mary kindly put out on the website at the materials page. Meditation 49 was in the part of the whole packet that you got that I had Mary post. That's all of these meditations for a sort of Lam Rim retreat, a Stages of the Path retreat. And the last few meditations pertain to emptiness. Meditation 49 is Chandrakirti's 7-fold reasoning using a car. And of course, in 50, we use the self, the I. And the first 5 points are the 5-fold analysis. And then we add on the 7-fold analysis. So again, when we talk about possession, where was possession in here? Number 3, kind of again, the numbering is a little different in this. It says there, does the self possess its parts? There are 2 ways that one thing can possess another. The way a person possesses a nose, or I used ear or eye, whatever. The possessor and object possessed are one entity. If the self possessed its parts in this way, then the self and its parts, the body and mind, would be inherently one. They'd be one entity, because we're examining inherent existence. So thus they would be, the same faults as what we see when we simply examine sameness of entity, which is what all these faults that would be accrued up here. There would be many eyes because you have many parts that you are possessing. You would only have one part because there's only one eye, because they have to be equivalent. And again, we can't point to just one part of all of that we're possessing and say that that's equivalent in its entirety to the eye. So then the other way of possessing is in the way a person possesses a dog, or Devadatta possesses a cow, or whatever the case might be. And that's where the possessor and the object possessed are different entities. If the self possessed its parts in this way, then the self and its parts, the body and mind, would be inherently different and separate. There would be the same faults that we saw in number 2, which is essentially that if you get rid of all the parts of the body and mind, then there would still be an I kind of remaining. It would be totally separate and other. We also could say other consequences that we went through last time, which are that everything that happens to the body and mind, all of its aging and so on, that happens to the body, that the person wouldn't experience that. It would be totally removed from that, because the I is not one with in any way the body and mind. It's completely, utterly, inherently different. So again, this is the consequences of this. And again, the note that's on there is an interesting one. Conventionally, the self does possess its parts, but not inherently. This is getting at this idea that there's really nothing wrong with me saying my body and my mind, but not inherently. It's not an inherently existent I that's having inherent possession of the body or mind. Rather, it's just nominally existing as that. So I can say my hand, but it's not an inherently existent my that is possessing my hand. Otherwise, again, it would be run into all those same faults. Yeah, Patrick, you had your hand up, I think. Yes.
Hi, Don. I had when I first got involved with Buddhism quite a few years ago, but not seriously. I had a yoga teacher who said, I am my body and mind. I have a body and mind, but I am not my body and mind." Does that ring true at all, or does that make any sense at all in the context of what you're saying?
Sure. I mean, again, we would say that in terms of defining it more clearly as inherent existence, when we really look at it and we say, I'm going to mute you for a second because I think we're getting a bit of feedback around. Sorry. Thanks, Patrick. When we talk about that I have a body and mind, well, then we're talking about the mere I that is the possessor of that, as I was just indicating. So we can speak to that and think of the I that is merely imputed possessing in a mere purely imputed way the body or mind or whatever it is that we're referring to. But when we get into the second statement that I am not my body and mind, well, then we have to again use that within the understanding that if we go seeking for an inherently existent I, an I that is equivalent to the body and mind in all ways, then we don't find it to exist in that way. It can't be found among the body, mind, what have you. It's also, though, very hard for me to tell because I don't know the full connotation that this yoga teacher was giving this. Some people could interpret it in a different tradition and probably a very different way, and maybe say that as we talked about, I think we talked about that a little bit in this class about this whole idea of an atman or a soul, something that would be not body and mind, that would be you, which seems to be the way that atman is approached in the Vedic traditions. So it's hard to say if this yoga teacher was meaning that or what, but in the context of a Buddhist interpretation of that, at least a Madhyamika interpretation of that, we would say that that's the way we would look at it, is that we do find that there is nothing here that is the I in that inherent way that exists completely as the I among the body and mind. So that statement, I am not my body and mind, would be totally valid in that context, but it doesn't imply that there's something else that is the I. And that's what we're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. I haven't talked about this whole idea of a non-affirming negation throughout all of this, and I realized today that I really better bring this up, and it was brought up in the context of the reasoning that helps us to realize selflessness of phenomena, produced phenomena, what's called the diamond slivers reasoning, which we'll go into a little tonight. But so it is important that we don't see that that's implying that there is something then that is the I, like the Atman or like some other thing that isn't mentioned among the body and mind, those aggregates. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that statement. Again, we just have to put our interpretation on what those words are and what that's saying. So does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyone else before we go back to the material?
Let's see, Don. Uh,
Yes.
what about, I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit more because you're always talking about inherently existing. But I
Hmm.
think it would be helpful to really explain what inherently existent is
Hmm.
and how inherently existing is different than normal existing.
Yeah.
Because that's such a key idea.
Yeah, and I'm hoping I did that with that one class where we went into the object of negation and really trying to define it. But again, what we're talking about is something that is able to set itself up, that exists on its own. That sort of sense of an independent existence. So when again I hold up anything like this bowl, it has this false appearance that is indicative of what this conception is grasping at, which is the sense that we feel that it's got its boldness located out here, that it is entirely one with these parts that I'm holding in my hand. Or if I hold up my little wrist mala, that it seems to have its own, whoops, that fell off again, put it upside down, that it seems to have its own sort of mala-ness. It's a weird word, but it is established kind of with that identity on these parts. And recall that the process that we go through, I didn't talk about this as much in this class. I did this at last Saturday's Wisdom of Emptiness module, Discovering Buddhism, where essentially we have something appears to us, and we don't usually, I mean, we might have new things appearing to us as adults, but mostly when we are first learning what things are in our world, something appears to us, and it's just simply a basis for some sort of label. And then we learn the label for it. So we are first just merely putting a label on things. And this is what we learned from our parents, right? So we learn, something like this is a book. And so we learned the label for it when we were quite young, and we maybe even said the word book, and we kind of began to understand what bookness was about, what it meant to be a book as opposed to something else. And so we, in the initial stage, are quite correct in simply labeling it. But because we have this fault of having grasped at inherent existence since beginningless time, it now appears back to us as if it has its own bookness. The book seems to be established out here on its own. That's the second step in the process. So the first step is something appears that you designate, that you label as that. The second step is that once the label is given to it, the label seems to absorb into it. This is a trick within our own minds that's caused by our own imprints of ignorance, so that it seems to be existing on its own out here. It seems to be self-established as a book. It's almost as if, after we've labeled it, then it seems like it was just there waiting to be labeled as that. It already had its own identity as that. And we were simply correctly identifying it for what it already is. That's almost the sense that's going on at that level. And then, of course, we assent to that. We agree to that. Our ignorance doesn't question that in the least. Why? Because we believe in this appearance. And we have the conception of inherent existence from beginningless time that causes us to continue to believe in that. So again, inherent existence, there's a lot of terms. We went through the whole list from Jeffrey Hopkins' meditation on emptiness, of all these hypothetical synonyms, things that seem to mean the same thing as that if it were to exist. They're hypothetical because it doesn't exist at all. But it essentially is anything that has an ability to establish itself, to be self-instituting, to exist from its own side by way of its own characteristics. I mean, again, we could use a lot of terminology, but it's what we're surrounded with. Everything appears this way. It all has that appearance. Yeah, John. Oh, got it?
Yep.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, you're freezing up now, John.
No, I think Bob was getting at, which was, okay, I'll take my video off. Shall I?
Yeah, that might be better because it's a bit choppy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. It's in one respect where you take when you're saying when you do the analysis that okay, I don't exist in that inherent way.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is okay, how do I merely exist?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was thinking. Okay, you held up your mala.
Mm-hmm.
I only see the mala if I'm using the logic.
Right.
The true way the mala exists, it's changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's I've only frozen it in one moment of time. It doesn't put together all the factors that came in to support that mala being created in the first place and then breaking down. You don't see all of, is that the mere existence? It's merely existing because it's but only in that moment of time. It's always changing. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I am pretty sure I know what you mean. But again, this is one level that we can talk about, because I didn't come back around then to talk about how do things actually exist. This is what we went into with dependent arising, right? The reasoning of dependent arising says that we can find, for something that's produced like this mala, we can find three ways that it is existing in a dependent manner, as dependent upon its causes and conditions. And of course, causes and conditions implies what you're talking about, impermanence, that it's constantly changing, that it's something that's totally in flux, and therefore can't have any sort of inherent identity, because inherent identity would mean it's fixed, would mean that it is going to stay that way all the time. That would be the implication of something actually existing inherently. Whereas things that are in flux, that are arising from causes and conditions, go on to morph into other things, and to, eventually some of them go out of existence. And certainly even when they go out of existence, some sort of transformation that happens. All impermanent phenomena are constantly a part of a process that we're simply giving labels to for particular portions of that process. We're going to get into that a little bit when we talk about the selflessness of phenomena. We use a seed and a sprout as the example for how you can't have any sort of inherent production, because by its nature, production arising from causes and conditions means it can't exist inherently. It can't exist in a fixed way. So that is one level of dependent arising, but the second and the third level get at subtler ways that we can really understand it. That helps us to have an appreciation for how things are mere malas, merely named or merely imputed malas, and the merely imputed I on the basis of this collection of stuff. In the second level, again, we study that idea of the dependence upon parts, where something like, again, a person is dependent upon the parts of the mind and the body, and of course all of their various parts in order to exist. You can't have a person without the parts. You sort of have the whole that is designated to the parts. But then when you get into that subtler level around designation and imputation, you see that there is nothing, again, from the side of those parts that are the basis of designation that makes it into what you're designating it as. The designation is a conceptual framework you're giving to things. And we need a conceptual framework to work with the world around us, to be able to understand things, to relate to each other, what have you. So we give everything that designation, as I was saying earlier, and then that designation seems to be coming from the side of the object. It seems to have its own identity, seems to be self-established. And then we grasp at that. That's how our ignorance takes off. But everything is merely imputed. There's no real book in my hand. There's no real mala in my other hand. These are simply bases for designating this is book and this is mala. And those labels work perfectly fine. They help us to organize our world and to relate to things. But we think there are real books, and we think there are real malas, and we think there's a real me. And of course, the real me is where everything revolves around that strong sense of an I. And this is where we get into trouble. So this is the idea behind it. I don't, did that help, John? Is that in line with what you were thinking, or?
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's equally hard to see things in how they inherently exist as it is to merely exist. You know, you know what I mean? Well, anyway, I think we're on the same page.
Yeah. And I didn't quite catch that last part. I'm sorry.
I think we're on the same page.
Okay, good. Yes, I mean, I think so, because again, what we're trying to do is to delineate what is this extra stuff that is put on top, you know, this false sense of an I, and really refute that and make sure we can understand what we're refuting. But then you don't go too far. Again, this is that whole idea of the two extremes. Right now, we are totally believing in this up here. We have to remove that, but not go below what actually does exist. And what actually does exist is very, very subtle. And you're right, to realize even the subtleness of this level of dependent arising, that things are merely imputed. I mean, if you sit with it for a while and kind of, again, meditate on it again and again, you can get to some taste of that, you know, we all are simply thoughts, simply designations on a basis. It's not to say that there's no basis for us, but even you investigate that basis and you see that that basis doesn't have any substantial or inherent existence. It's merely imputed. And so it becomes like, they always say, like peeling an onion. You never find like a core, something in the very middle that you can go, ah, there's the real thing that all of this is kind of built up around. You never find anything that has any mode of existing beyond mere imputation, beyond mere designation. And everything functions totally fine that way. It always has. What I find always reassuring is that it's not like I'm discovering something that's that you know isn't there already. It's something that already is there. It's how everything has always functioned. We've always been merely imputed beings on a merely imputed basis, on merely imputed actions in a merely imputed samsara with merely imputed, you know, all of this. So there's nothing that, you know, is outside of the realm of what we're already experiencing. It's just that we're seeing it wrong. We have the wrong view. And so we have to, again, get rid of that overlay that is false and not fall into the extreme of a sort of nihilistic bent where we think things don't exist at all. Because things still do exist, but their existence is very, very subtle. Again, we use that phrase nominal existence. If things exist nominally, it means in name only. You know, there's a name for something, and again, that can be conceptualized or certainly verbalized in language, but that's it. That identity that we give to things is how they get their identity. They don't have any identity from their own side. But all the lower Buddhist schools find this to be outrageous. I mean, I think this is like, we've gone too far. We're just refuting the existence of things completely, because if they don't have any inherent nature, then they can't exist. But that's what our ignorance believes in. That's why Rinpoche often says that the object of negation It can also be identified as what the school just before the Prasangika Madhyamika, the Svatantrika Madhyamika, if we look at what they're holding to, and I'll go into this very briefly, but I think it's an important point. What they say is that you do depend upon an imputing consciousness to designate things, but there has to be some mark, some sign from this side of this basis to indicate what it is. That's inherent nature. That's something from the side of, this that indicates that this is mala and not, book or not some other phenomenon. And by virtue of that appearing and then being designated as such, that's how things exist. Anything more than that, they would refute. Prasangika says, no, you guys haven't gone far enough. There's nothing from the side of this that makes it mala. It is simply my mind imputing mala that gives its identity. And of course, we can identify mala and book as different phenomena simply because they're different bases for these phenomena. There's nothing more than that. But it's a conceptual designation that we are making to those things. There's nothing from the side of the objects at all, like they say, not one atom of inherent existence. Yeah, Patrick, you had your hand up. Oh, I'm sorry, Tony had his hand up.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I did missed your little hand up there, Tony.
My little blue hand.
Your little blue hand. I'll turn it off.
You might have been very prescient in that comment that you would turn it off. So the reason I rose my hand is because with your permission, I would like to submit a verse that I wrote. It's titled Samsara and Nirvana, Fully Empty. And this is realization that I have on very rare occasion when in Shamatha Vipassana.
Okay.
And I would like to present it for comment. Okay.
All right.
Sitting silently in meditative stability and concentration, the light turned around, looking within, original nature is revealed, fully empty, with nothing to hold on to or let go of. Both samsara and nirvana self-liberate, simultaneously interpenetrate, and liberate each other. Empty, non-dual and free, samsara and nirvana unfold and uphold the realm of reality. Luminous, deep, inconceivable, gone beyond.
Very nice. Yeah, again, it's your experience. So I think you can speak more to what it is, but the words that you used sounded very evocative of what I think we're aiming for. This idea of not concretizing everything, but everything being in this space. Of arising out of emptiness. We can say that, that it is their empty nature that causes samsara, nirvana, everything to be simply, again, designated as such, what have you. So that was very nice. Thank you, Tony. Anyone else? Patrick, well, first, let's see if there anyone else who would like to comment on Tony's verse, if you are open to hearing from anyone else. But
oh, sure.
I was just typing in, beautiful, Tony.
Good. Yes.
Save me typing.
Good.
That's sweet. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Tony. Anyone else? Are there any other hands up? I'm not seeing any hands up. Are we, okay. Then Patrick, let's go to Patrick's question. Thank you for sharing that, Tony. I appreciate it very much. Very nice. Yeah, Patrick.
No, I was just, and I'm coming into this class tonight, and I realize I've missed, I think, one class before. So I'm trying to kind of get with what you're going with. But in terms of dependent co-arising, are either the objects that you're talking about, the book or the mala, have dependent co-arising, or is that a silly question?
Dependent co-arising. The term I'm usually using is dependent arising. Are you meaning something?
Dependent, right? I'm sorry. So yes, that's what I meant.
All right.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that you weren't coming up with some other.
Sorry. Yes, that's right.
So absolutely, everything that exists is a dependent arising. And
Right.
those things that are produced, they arise from their causes and conditions, but everything arises on the basis of parts and on the basis of mere designation, mere imputation, which is the subtlest level that we can understand dependent arising, which is what I was kind of emphasizing with the points I was making, that there's no real book in my hand.
Right.
There's no basis for book. Book exists simply by our designating it as such, conceptualizing this as such. And of course, it meets the definition of book. That's why I wouldn't define, I wouldn't use the word book for this, because it doesn't meet the definition of book. It doesn't serve the function of book. But all of that is what we impute on it. And it's not just man-made things. I mean, people get the impression sometimes, because I'm always using, things that are on my desk here, that it's man-made things. Trees are also lacking any inherent existence and exist by mere imputation. They depend upon their causes and conditions. They depend upon their parts, and then they end up being simply a designation of tree that we give to that collection of the roots with the trunk and the branches and the leaves and where pine needles or whatever it is that is going on with that tree. So we have this collection of stuff that is not a tree from its own side. It's a tree because it arises in dependence upon all those factors and is in the end merely imputed as tree. There are no real trees, to use Rinpoche's language.
Right.
There is no real I. There is no real anything, because things don't have the ability to set themselves up.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Bob.
Thank you.
Yeah, one thing that sort of helps me with the designation is that usually the objects that we talk about them as being a unitary object, a single thing, like a tree or a car or a
Right.
table. And when you see that, you can see that all of these things are made up of parts. And when we make them a unitary thing in our mind, that's what you sort of mean by the designation. That we take something that's a complex whole and we make it a single object in our mind. And so that's
Right.
To an idea of the designation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, and I've been trying to emphasize that idea when we go through this. Again, that's where most of our consequences come from, is the fact that if we are looking for something that is unitary among something that has parts, that has things involved in it, you can never find anything that is equivalent, because everything has parts, and so you're never going to find a unitary basis for something that is a single whole that we are designating to something. Again, when we use that term of mind-body complex, we think, well, that's a unitary thing, right? Mind-body complex. It's the whole thing together. But that's a complex. It consists of at least two things. But again, each of those two things even having their own things, their own parts. So you have always this partness to things. And that by its very nature also means that you can't find anything that is completely inherently one, inherently unitary phenomenon. Can't find a referent of that would be that object in all ways, because everything has parts. Even emptiness has parts. And you might think, well, what are the parts of emptiness? We can talk about temporal parts. We can talk about the emptiness of the I now, and the next moment, and the next moment, and so on. And emptiness is merely designated. It's designated to a lack of inherent existence. We talk about lack of inherent existence. That's the referent point of the term emptiness. That is what we mean by emptiness. So everything exists through mere imputation, and we can't find any phenomenon that is equivalent to that object in that way, as Bob was pointing out. The fact that it has parts belies that. You could never find anything in that inherently existent way, because it would have to be unitary. The basis would have to be one and equivalent to that whole then. And because it has parts, you're always going to have more. So you end up with all these consequences. All right, are we ready to get back to the material at hand? This has been good, though. This is why we almost need these kind of discussions in addition to this, and hopefully we are going to be going into the Heart Sutra in the new year, and we'll try to figure out a way to, I think we're working on that, Mary, and so on, to have some discussion at the end of each class. I used to do that when I was teaching at TNL, where we would have like the beginning prayer is about an hour lecture. We'd have a short break, and then we would come back and discuss things and try to facilitate that sort of thing, because it's useful to have people coming in with questions and points of view, and some back and forth from students as well as from me. I mean, I don't need to be involved all the time. So, Barbara, did you have something before we go on? Yeah. Are you off? There you go.
I did. And I don't know if this is the right time to ask this, I hear a phrase, form is emptiness and emptiness is form.
Mhm.
But I don't understand that. Or is that
Okay.
just way too much?
No, no, no. I think I may have referred to that phrase last week very briefly, but essentially what it's referring to is the fact that you have the conventional nature of things, which is how things are established through mere designation, mere imputation. And then you have the emptiness of things. And those are always existing, together. We can identify them conceptually separate. We can say, oh, I'm going to look at the lack of inherent existence of the I. And that's a way of understanding that ultimate truth with regard to the I. But then we understand that the I itself exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, in dependence upon parts, in the end, in dependence upon mere imputation. This is its conventional nature. So when we say the same thing with regard to form, which is the conventional nature of that which is matter, that which has physical form, is together with its emptiness, the emptiness of form. We're not making them equivalent in all ways. We're not saying all emptinesses are form and all forms are emptiness and making them kind of total equivalent. This phrase is shorthand for saying within form arising, there is its emptiness. Within the emptiness of form, there is the form. And it's sort of understanding the two sides of the coin within the idea that they're inextricably bound up with each other. Every phenomenon that exists is together with its own emptiness, because that's the only way it could exist, is together with lacking any inherent existence. And so we have the conventional nature of things, which is in this case form in the Heart Sutra, is together with its emptiness. Its emptiness is together with its form. And then it goes on to say, form is not anything other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form, meaning that you don't find anything beyond those. Those are the limits of it. Form together with its emptiness, period, and emptiness together with its form. You don't really have anything else that would fall, kind of through the cracks or be in addition to it or what have you. And this is how everything that exists arises, is together with its own emptiness. That's why, as we were saying earlier in comment to Tony's wonderful verse, that this is how things all arise, is out of emptiness, we could say, because it's within their lack of inherent existence that things can exist. Again, that phrase from Nagarjuna's text of within, for the person for whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. Because when we understand emptiness and we get that everything can arise within that, samsara can arise, nirvana can arise, everything can arise, emptiness can arise. But if we don't hold to emptiness, then nothing can arise. You actually could never have anything existing if it wasn't for emptiness. Sounds pretty wild, but this is kind of what we're aiming for in that simple statement of form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Again, we're not saying they are absolutely identical, that if you looked up the definition for form, it would be emptiness. And if you looked at the definition of emptiness, it would be form. That's not what that statement's meaning. It's rather referring to this inextricably bound up thing, that every phenomenon is together with its emptiness. Everything that exists is together with a lack of inherent existence. So in this way, we say there are infinite numbers of emptinesses because everything is empty. So even parts of things are empty. Everything has together with its emptiness. But they're all of that one taste because they're all the same ultimate reality of lacking any inherent existence. But nonetheless, the diversity of phenomena appear within that. So we can have form, we can have feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness, all these various aggregates. We can have everything that is a part of what we mean by form. You can talk about visual form, you can talk about sound, you can talk about odors and various tastes and tactile sensations. You have so many different things that fit into the category of form or matter. So again, we have everything encapsulated in that, in terms of the final teaching of the Buddha on how the two truths are manifested. The truth of conventional phenomena that are simply designated, that come around to understand that is hard to understand and get to, is what John was pointing to really get that subtle level in which things exist. And then you have their emptiness together with that. And these are completely complementary, as we saw in that verse from the Lama Tsongkhapa. Is that help a little bit? Okay, we'll get into that verse when we get to the Heart Sutra. If you want to join the Heart Sutra class, that'll be around this same time, 7 to 9. It'll be a little bit later and go a little bit later, start a little bit later and go a little bit later, because again, we'll be incorporating some discussion into that. But about an 8-week course, and we'll be talking about that being it's part of the basic program if you'd like to move in that direction to fulfill some of the requirements for the basic program. And I'll give some information on that at the very first class. But all right, now can we move back into the material? Yeah, thank you for all these questions. Oh, these are good. Yeah, we need to think maybe budget for that kind of time too, for just coming in and, you know, being with whatever questions people are having, because a lot of stuff comes up when you get into these teachings on emptiness. So when we go on to the sevenfold analysis, there's this wonderful verse of that comes from Emptiness Yoga. This was from some unidentified sutra. Jeffrey Hopkins didn't identify which one, but the idea is I use a chariot. Again, in the meditation that I had you work with, it's a car, I believe. But it says, just as a car or a chariot is designated in dependence upon collections of parts, so conventionally a sentient being is designated in dependence upon the aggregates. So this is getting at its merely imputed nature, but this is pointing in the direction of this whole analysis of a chariot. That was in the meditation that I encouraged you to work with over this week, but you can again continue to work with that over the next week if you'd like. And this is what's in Chandrakirti's sevenfold analysis. I should put this verse in the packet, and I apologize for not having it there, but again, I'll get these slides to Mary and she'll put them up on the website so that you can copy this one down too. This is from the same book, Jeffrey Hopkins' Emptiness Yoga. I like this translation of this verse. I looked at some other ones and they weren't quite as compact. So if we talk about a car or a chariot, I put numbers on it that apply to what we were talking about in terms of the first 5. First, that it's not asserted to be other than its parts. That's the complete difference, the inherent difference. Nor is it non-other. Non-other means same. I mean, it's kind of weird. They use these double negatives, nor non-other. So nor, meaning it's not the same. It's not, non-other. It's not the same. It also does not possess them. And again, we had the 2 levels of possession, which were possessing it as the sameness within sameness and possessing it within difference. And then we have it's not in the parts, nor are the parts in it. Does the car or the chariot exist in the parts as kind of something among the parts, or are the parts within what we call car or chariot? We looked at those previously. So we've looked at the first few lines already. What Chandrakirti adds in this analysis, which is kind of an interesting one, and it works very well with physical phenomena, but nonetheless, it could work certainly with the person to some degree, the person that is merely imputed on the collection of the aggregates. But, when we talk about it in relation to the I, it has a slightly different way of presenting it. But the 6th one is not that the fact that the car or the chariot is not the mere collection of its parts. Again, this is something we already have alluded to some degree when we talk about the collection of mind-body being the basis for the I that is designated on that. Is the I then equivalent? The inherently existent I, can we find it as being equivalent to the mere collection of parts? Well, with a car or a chariot, you can take apart those and you can pile all of the parts that would be involved in your automobile. If you own an automobile, what would be all the parts, and put them in a big pile. And we see that it can't be the mere collection of those parts, because those parts, obviously, they have to be assembled. There isn't a car on the basis of simply a pile of those parts. And there are other consequences that we would see if it was the mere collection. But again, it would be an idea of sameness, that if we find it to be equivalent to the mere collection of the parts, then it has to be a unitary phenomenon that is identical among the mere collection that would be equivalent. And you would also have, once more, many parts. So a collection is not a unitary phenomenon. A collection is a diverse phenomenon, and everything has a collection of parts. So you're always going to have a multitude of things that we're simply giving a unitary label to. We're putting the label of a car on a collection of car parts. So nor is it their shape. This is one thing that does come into play even with people to some degree. We might recognize somebody walking from a distance because we recognize their shape, right? And we think, oh, the shape is their person. Well, that only applies to physical parts, right? Can you talk about the shape of your mind? You know, our minds don't have shape. You know, our minds don't have shape or color, any of the physical characteristics that form does. So there's a problem right here because we run into that same thing. This is also an idea of sameness, kind of finding something that is the shape of the physical form that would be equivalent to the mere I, or I'm sorry, the I that we are holding to be inherently, to kind of find that to be the exact referent of that inherently existent I. Well, shape only applies to form, so it's not going to apply to your body or to your mind. It only applies to your body. So in that way, you would have a fault right there because you're excluding any kind of identification of the mind being involved, because the body has to be equivalent in all ways then to the I, or in this case, the shape of the body. But in terms of a car, that is something where, once more, we also recognize the shape of a car, and that's how we identify which one is our car and what have you when there's a parking lot full of cars, by their shape and their color. But we would have the same faults that if we say that that is equivalent to the car in all ways, meaning it's an inherently existing car, well, then nothing else could be the car. And shape is obviously only one component of it. And of course, they do a deeper investigation with the car as to, well, does it different then from the shape of the parts? Because there's no change in the shape of the parts when they assemble them into a car, and all these various investigations, which I don't know that I'll go into in as much detail. But the last line of this, the self and the aggregates are similar, means that you can do a similar type of analysis with regard to the I. So again, I'm just going to go through what I would just said in terms of sameness. The first 2 points are exactly what we saw previously with the fivefold analysis. The sixth and the seventh are both analyses of sameness. Is the inherently existent I or car or whatever equivalent to the collection of the parts of the aggregates in the case of the person, or are they equivalent to the shape of the aggregates or the parts? And in that way, we can find that there is no inherently existent I that is the same as the aggregates. We also find that there's no inherently existent I that is, or no inherently existent car that is the collection of the parts or the shape of the parts and so on. In terms of difference, it's exactly the same as what we saw before. So once more, even in the sevenfold analysis, everything fits very neatly into analyses of sameness and analyses of difference. So let's take a look at the 2 points that were raised by Chandrakirti that he added to the fivefold analysis in regard to that meditation that again, was part of that larger group of meditations. Lam Rim outline, Lam Rim meditations that Venerable Sangye Kadro put together. So these are numbers 6 and 7 then here. Let's look at what it says and kind of get an appreciation for how those would be applied in relation to the self. Is the self the collection of the aggregates? Again, we mean inherently the collection of the aggregates, because we couldn't say the collection of the aggregates are the basis for the self, but they aren't the inherent basis for the self. We don't find them to be equivalent to that inherently existent I or self that we are grasping at. If this were the case, we could take the aggregates apart and put all the parts in a heap, and it would still be a self. Is this true? I mean, it's kind of a gross thought to take all of your parts of the basis of a self and pile them somewhere. Sounds like a true crime mystery or something. But, you know, if you mentally do this, just kind of imagine taking all the various parts that are part of the collection of the parts. Well, that collection of parts, when it's not assembled into what a person is, wouldn't be the I. It would be totally, not feasible as a basis for that I, not feasible any longer to be identified as the I. So it says here, the aggregates are the basis of designation of the self, and therefore cannot be the self. And this is sort of gets into that whole idea that I mentioned previously, that these are actually two different phenomena: the basis of designation and the object that is designated. These are related in that one is the basis for the designation and the other is what is designated to it. So there is kind of that relationship, but they are not equivalent. They are in a nature of being different. They are, not inherently different, again, because inherent difference doesn't exist, but they are different nonetheless. The I that is designated to the mind-body complex, this collection of parts, the aggregates, is different from those. But it is related to those. And of course, the aggregates are the basis of designation for that. And that's the relationship that exists. So the collection of the aggregates are simply the basis of designation. The I, the self, is merely imputed on that. So even our reasoning of dependent arising can come back in to aid us in this analysis and help us to understand that if there is that relationship, well, then there can't be anything among the collection that is the I, because the I is a label simply given to that. That's why, again, dependent arising and emptiness are pointing to the same truth, the same reality. Then number 7 is the self, the person, the shape of the aggregates. Well, the self cannot be the shape of the aggregates, especially the body, because we don't have a shape to our feelings or a shape to our discrimination or our consciousness. Why? Because the shape is just physical, whereas the self also has consciousness and all the components of consciousness, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, what have you. Also, the shape does not inherently exist because it is merely imputed on the collection of shapes of the individual parts. Those individual parts that are assembled into this person, we then have a shape that is imputed on the collection of the shapes of the parts, and each of those parts having a shape that is merely imputed on the shape within them, and so on. We once more can reinforce our understanding of dependent arising, or bring that into bear in this to reinforce what we're recognizing with regard to emptiness. They're pointing to the same reality. Things cannot be self-instituting, self-established, because they depend upon this whole process of arising, especially the subtlest way, that they depend upon mere designation. Again, I don't need to necessarily go through that in regard to the car or the chariot, but you might review that if you haven't, because it's a little bit different when you're talking about something that's purely physical. Because that 7th one especially is not going to play in this in the same way, right? Because in the case of the I being merely imputed to mind body, if you say it's the shape of the body, well, then that excludes the mind from being involved, right? As I just went through. But if you talk about a car, or a mala, or whatever the case might be, anything that's physical, well, then you can get into there's only a physicality to it. There's no consciousness together with this mala that's part of the basis for mala. It's all physical, so you might think, oh, well, then it's the shape of my mala. That's what the inherently existent mala is. Well, and again, you run into consequences from that too. As I was saying, if you kind of analyze it from the point of view of, well, was there a shape of the parts that is somehow changed when it is together like this? Because then you can have the same collection of parts with their same shape, and you should have the object. But you, just like you had with the disassembled parts earlier, you don't have that. They have to be assembled into this. But again, we don't see when we assemble all the parts, when I take all the individual beads and thread them on this elastic and put the little guru bead, the eye bead in there, and put this all together, we don't see me adding anything to that in terms of shape. It's just all the individual shapes have now been assembled in this regard. And so where did that shape come from? I don't witness any sort of inherently existent shape that is a unitary phenomenon that is coming into play. Rather, it's the shape of all the individual parts that then make up what we call the mala, and the basis for designating this as mala. So it's a similar type of analysis. It's a little different when it's purely physical. So you might read through that, but that's also one, again, that you could use to analyze phenomena other than the persons. It's introduced in Chandrakirti's texts within the context of both, in a sense, but primarily to be used as that deeper investigation into how we think about the I. How do we think about this inherently existent I, and equating it often to something that is not just same or different, but to some part, and some way that we want to make sure we eliminate any possible misconceptions we might have and do a much deeper analysis. So that's the idea behind the sevenfold reasoning. And I need to maybe just go on, and we'll see if there are any questions in the last few minutes. But let me move on into the next part of this, which is the 4th of these 6 subjects that are in your booklet, investigating the self of phenomena. So as I said, you could use the same analysis that was done of a car or a chariot and analyze for any phenomena that are other than persons. Nonetheless, there is another investigation that is introduced. You have a verse, whoops, what happened to my verse 1.1? Oh, this is right. I took this from earlier. Remember when I went through the earlier pages, this was verse 138 from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. That was back on page 5. I threw it forward to here because in the commentary that Khensur Jampa Tekchok gives, he talks about this being related to this analysis that I'm going to introduce you to tonight briefly, this diamond slivers analysis. So in verse 37, which isn't in your booklet, and I'm introduced that because the commentary that Khensur Jampa Tekchok gives refers to both of these verses. He's talking about the wheel of cyclic existence, what is often, the embodiment or the picturing of the or symbolization of the 12 links of dependent arising. This wheel of cyclic existence is not, one, obtained from self. Two, it's not obtained from something that is inherently other. It's not obtained from something that is both self and other in any of the three times. And the conception of I is overcome, and thereby action and rebirth. So we don't find something that arises from self, rises from other, rises from both. And of course, the fourth point that we're going to get into when we examine this is also something that doesn't arise from any causes, causelessly. And that would be the fourth alternative. But of course, we know things do come into existence, so it would be an unlikely way for things to come into existence inherently. So the verse that you did have in your book on page 5 is this one from Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. One who sees then how cause and effect are produced and destroyed does not regard the world as really existent or non-existent, meaning it doesn't adhere to that strong sense of inherently existence, which is the one extreme, nor do they fall into the extreme of complete utter non-existence. We find that middle way when we see how cause and effect are produced and destroyed, just in the way that the analogy we're going to eventually get to, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight, of the seed and the sprout. The seed is destroyed in the process of giving rise to the sprout, but it's not utterly destroyed, completely nihilistically destroyed. Rather, something new is produced from that. The sprout arises from the seed disintegrating, the sprout arising. In this way, there's just a nominal process of cause and effect that's going on. And it's the same as was said in that previous verse with regard to our being in samsara, that things are not produced from something that is identical to them, nor from something that is completely other than them, totally different, unrelatedly different, nor from something that is both the same and different, nor causelessly. Again, causelessly isn't mentioned in this verse, but it's coming up in one of the verses that we're going to look at. All right. So in talking about this, Khensur Jampa Tekchok says, just as one link of these 12 links follows another in the causal chain of cyclic existence, so do subsequent links cease when their prior link has ceased. This is an example of causal dependence and illustrates that whatever arises dependently cannot exist inherently. It is neither inherently existent nor totally non-existent, but rather it exists dependently in that middle way. In the Precious Garland, Nagarjuna sets out many reasonings to prove emptiness. He elaborates on some more than others. In these two verses, he speaks of what is called the diamond slivers reasoning, that refutes inherently existent arising or production. This is expressed actually in the very first verse of his treatise on the middle way, which is the verse you have at the beginning of this section 4 in your booklet on page 8. And so let me put that on the screen. Neither from itself, nor from another, nor from both, itself and another, nor without a cause, causelessly, does anything whatever anywhere arise. So let me talk about this a little bit, and then we'll share a little bit more of what the screens were showing. But this diamond slivers, it's called that because if you take slivers of a diamond, they all kind of have their own diamond nature within them. And so it's the idea that we have this power of this reasoning to produce within each of these four reasonings an equal powerful statement against things having any inherent existence. And so that's the idea behind why it's called that or named that. But it's essentially often called production from the four extremes, where we essentially see that if something is produced, which we can talk about in regard to, again, the example we're going to use is the seed and the sprout. A sprout is produced from a seed. Okay, so if something is produced, is what it's produced from, the cause of it, inherently the same as it? And we don't even have to use inherently, because we know that things are not identical, or else there'd be no reason to plant seeds and get the sprouts and have the whole process unfold, right? Because you already have it there in the seed. If it's identical, meaning the same as in all ways, well, then there's no need for it to arise later. Or is it utterly different? Here's where we do have to use inherently. And that's because, as I was pointing out earlier, things are different. They just don't have any inherent difference. Inherent difference would mean that the sprout and the seed are totally unrelatedly different, meaning that seed never has any relationship to sprout, sprout never has any relationship to seed. And cause and effect are not that way, right? Causes of something give rise to the effect. The effect of something depends upon its causes. There's mutual dependence between these two. So we don't have anything that is inherently different, but nonetheless we have differences all the time, right? We can talk about a sprout as being very different from a seed, but it's not completely, utterly, inherently different, or the sprout could never arise from the seed. But if there is inherent production of things, then it would have to be completely, utterly different, because it's only in the mode of dependent arising that things would depend in that way, that effects would depend upon their causes, and even causes upon their effects. The third option is, okay, you got something that's both the same and different. Well, if you've refuted those two, of sameness and difference, you've refuted that something can be both, because it can't be the same, because you've already refuted it's being same. You've refuted that it's inherently different, so it can't be that. So the idea that some philosophical schools might hold, where they think that things are both the same and different, wouldn't hold water either. The final one, that things arise causelessly, well, then that denies what we witness with our eyes, right? You put the seed in the ground, and you can even have it up against some glass or something to where you can see what's going on in the seed. In the dirt, you see something changing in it, and then a little sprout comes out, and then eventually comes up through the ground and forms into the whole plant. You would see that there are causes for things arising. They don't arise causelessly. There's the seed, and of course cooperative conditions that lend themselves to the seed actually germinating, and in terms of warmth, sunlight, moisture, nutrients, all these various things. The person has to, of course, put it into the ground for it to begin that whole process. So what we see rather is dependent arising as the implication of things not having any inherent production. And again, it's at that coarser level of dependent arising that we're looking at, causes and conditions. And so that's what we're analyzing in the diamond slivers, is causes and conditions in terms of, can there be inherent production of things? So just as a brief introduction to this, and that's maybe all that I have time for, if a thing existed inherently, Khensur Jampa Tekchok says in commenting again on that same verse where he just cited this one from Nagarjuna, it says it would have to arise in one of these four options. One, from itself, and you notice how two, he puts from an inherently existent cause that was other than itself. That's where you do have to have that, because nothing arises from itself conventionally. We don't see this happening. We also don't see something new coming from both itself and an inherently existent other. And we also don't see it without a cause. So we don't see these other things in our conventional awareness. Nonetheless, we have to refute them. Because they're part of the four extremes. They're part of the four ways that things could be produced if they were produced inherently. This one's a little tricky to work with. I may not have time to do this one justice with the remaining time I have tonight and next week. But so as he points out, and then what I was just saying, however, dependent things cannot arise in any of those ways. They arise as mere effects from mere causes, with that interrelationship of things arising in dependence upon other factors. Thus, they lack inherently existent arising or production, and are therefore empty of inherent existence. So this verse, as he points out in Insight into Emptiness, hopefully some of you have been spending some time with that book. Around page 175, you'll get into, he repeats that verse, verse number 1 of Nagarjuna's Fundamental Wisdom. It says that refutes the inherently existent arising or production that is asserted by others. The Samkhya, which is a non-Buddhist school in India, actually asserts some form of production from self. And I'm not going to go into huge depths about explaining all of that, because that goes beyond what we're able to do. But number 2, The lower Buddhist schools assert production from inherently existent others. As I pointed out earlier tonight, all the schools beneath the consequence middle way schools say that things are inherently existent, and yet they still do get produced. You have inherently existent causes that give rise to inherently existent effects. As I said, even that Svatantrika Madhyamika, the school that is the closest to Prasangika in its tenets, still says there has to be something inherently in the cause that will be why it can give rise to the effect, why it kind of has that identity, something within the bean seed that makes it into a bean sprout, So the Jain, a school that was present at the Buddha's time and still exists today, says things arise from both self and others, that both of them are involved in things coming into existence. While, fourthly, the materialist Charvaka school, often called the hedonist, they say that things arise without causes. So this is why the Buddha was refuting these to some degree, is because beings at that time who held other views were actually adhering to that. And of course, even in the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha didn't go to the full distance of disproving this with all disciples. So some Buddhist disciples will hold to inherent existence and still need to be nudged to that by this type of analysis. So Nagarjuna refutes all four of these wrong views, thus demonstrating that there is no inherent production. In none of these four ways does anything whatsoever, be it an external or an internal phenomena, be it form or consciousness or anything else, inherently arise. So I'm going to stop there and we'll go into the reasoning next time. This is kind of getting maybe a bit beyond where we can go tonight, and we've already had a pretty full evening, I think, with all of what we talked about. But this production from the four extremes is a way of working with all of those things that are causal, that are produced from their causes, that are effects of that, and seeing that there cannot be inherent existence within that process of production, because you'd have these faults. Because we do have to delineate, well, does it have a cause or doesn't it have a cause? If it doesn't have a cause, then it's the fourth option, right? Things arise causelessly, but we don't see that in the world around us, right? You don't just have a plant magically appearing before you without you having planted the seed or the bulb and the whole process of what goes on, So that's one option. They arise causelessly. If they arise from a cause, then we have three possibilities. One, they arise from something that is the same as it. Two, something that is completely, utterly different than it. Or three, something that is both. You don't have a fourth option again in the case of something that is caused. If it does arise in the way that dependent arising holds it, then it wouldn't fit into this, because again, we're trying to find inherent production. We're trying to find production that exists by way of its own characteristic. And so it would have to exist in one of these ways. In the end, production does exist in terms of something that is different. The seed is different than the sprout, right? We identify them differently. We have a different basis. At this point in time, we have something that is a seed that has not yet opened and germinated and what have you. Over here, we have the results of that process, of it having opened and the little, tendril come out and the sprout having occurred, right? It's a different basis at that point. So we have dependent arising going on here, but we don't have any inherent production going on here. This is what I'm going to hopefully be able to finish up a little bit in the next class. I'll see if I can find a meditation to help you to work with that if you want to already begin to explore that idea of production from the four extremes, or this diamond slivers analysis, and kind of work with that, because it is a powerful way for us to begin to identify how things therefore cannot possibly arise independently. They cannot have any sort of inherent existence. It's always going to be dependence upon other causes that things come into existence. And that reinforces our understanding of dependent arising, which then reinforces our understanding of emptiness. And again, we keep using these two to find that middle way, how things are dependent arisings in a conventional sense, how they are empty of inherent existence in the ultimate sense. And then we just eventually are able to hold those two together. All right, any final questions for tonight? I feel like I've kind of thrown everything in the kitchen sink at all of you tonight, but maybe not. Anyone? again, I would really encourage you, if you can spend time with Geshe Kensur Jampa Tekchog's book, Insight into Emptiness, and that would be a wonderful way to reinforce this. This is the chapter, it's around again 175, I think it's chapter 14. I think it's called something like Production from the Four Extremes, which is another name for this diamond slivers reasoning. I noticed there was something in the chat box. Let me take a look at that. Maybe outside the boundaries of this class, but quantum physics claims that in a vacuum, positrons and electrons can arise causelessly. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's probably beyond my my expertise too. Bob studied a lot more about quantum physics and what have you, so he might be able to address that question better than I can, because I don't. Um, yeah, I mean, I know that I've heard this sort of rumor. I don't know. I mean, I haven't studied this, and I don't really have the mind for it sometimes to be able to investigate quantum physics. But I've heard this thing that they've witnessed things. Yeah, I think they even have this experiment where they've seen things where effects arise before their causes, right? Isn't that true, Bob, in some way? Do you want to speak to
Well,
that?
not really. I mean, there are quantum fluctuations, and that's well
Yeah.
known. And that actually leads to a real effect that you can actually measure these quantum fluctuations with two little metal plates. It actually gives rise to a small force between these two little metal plates in vacuum, and it's called the Casimir effect. And it's a very, very tiny force, and it's only been, I think, in the last 10 years that they've had the scientific equipment that could actually measure this tiny force. So these quantum fluctuations really do fluctuate, and they can lead to real physical effects. So in a sense, they're really real, because you can actually measure a real force between two metal plates. But they don't really, I don't know, they're not really, I wouldn't call them sort of cause and effect, because they're things that, I don't know, exist for such an infinitesimally small amount of time, and they pop up and they fall away, and then other things pop up and fall away. So it's sort of different than it's quantum physics is just so outside of our normal way of thinking of things that I don't think it's very helpful.
It's interesting because sometimes His Holiness seems to say there's a lot of usefulness in knowing quantum physics as a platform or an entryway to emptiness, to understanding, some measure that things don't have any objective existence because of the subjective components involved in that. But nonetheless, I'm not an expert on any of this
Yeah,
at all.
I mean, the real problem is that nobody really understands quantum physics in an intuitive way. And I mean, physicists are good at calculating things. So you can calculate the effects of quantum physics, and the calculations agree with what you measure experimentally in a laboratory. But on an intuitive level, it's hard to really have any intuitive idea and to connect with it. And so lots of people like to use analogies of quantum physics for various things. But in my mind, it's actually not very helpful. It's more people just, thinking up wild things. So,
Okay.
so I don't think it's actually very helpful.
Okay.
Myself. He is a physicist.
Good. Well, speaking as a Buddhist, then I can agree with that, because I would rather not have to investigate quantum physics myself. So. But anyway, no, thank you for sharing your expertise, Bob, and thanks for the question, John. I don't know, maybe again, you two can have your own little Zoom where you can get into it in more depths. Do you have a background in quantum physics, John? Do you? Yeah, you do. Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted. Yeah.
Well, I have a scientific background, yeah, not in quantum physics, but
Okay.
I a little bit.
Okay. All right, good. Well, maybe we can, find a time for a little separate meeting where we can get into that. And I don't know, again, it depends. Bob seems to be saying, again, there's not as much usefulness in going into that. And again, some people have asked me, well, if somebody who's realizing some of what quantum physics has to reveal in the methodology they use, are they realizing emptiness? And I would say no, because they're probably still adhering to whatever it is that is appearing to them in an inherently existent way. They're not getting to that degree of understanding without an intentional investigation into that, because that's really not what quantum physics is trying to discern is, do things have inherent existence? It's trying to decide how things do exist within conventional reality, right? I mean,
And I would also say, I mean, the other reason it's not inherently existence is because quantum physics shows that everything is interconnected.
yeah.
And if everything's interconnected, it can't be independent the
Mhm.
way that an inherently
Right.
existent object were independent.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily come to the same conclusion upon realizing that interconnectedness that we would in Buddhism by steering our minds towards refuting inherent existence, right? I mean,
You don't really even think that way.
yeah,
You don't
exactly.
think in terms of inherently existent object.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is that sense that,
Mhm.
you know, I mean, if everything is interconnected, how can you carve out an isolated object?
Right, right.
But,
So it
so
can
I
be, I think, yeah, to what,
use reasoning to come to the same conclusion.
yeah,
But you know, they don't normally think in terms of inherently existence.
yeah. So to what I think His Holiness is alluding to, then it can help loosen up some of that, perhaps as an entryway for those who do the deeper philosophical investigation into ontological modes of existence. Really, how do things exist in terms of this investigation that Buddhism does that they wouldn't be thinking of, as you're saying. Yeah. All right. I think we've done it for tonight. I feel kind of baked myself. So I will work on getting a diamond slivers analysis of some sort to you. I don't recall if there was one in that packet. Maybe there was, and I just picked out the pieces that I was working with the sevenfold analysis. It might be in there, but I don't think it is. I'll see if I can locate something that can help you investigate that. But again, I haven't completely talked about it. But nonetheless, it would be useful, I think, to work with that a little bit if you can. Let's go ahead and do the prayers then, Bob, if you can get those on the screen, and we'll dedicate, as we usually do, with the first prayer where we dedicate all this positive energy for the benefit of all beings, that we achieve enlightenment for their sake. And then in the second verse where we recall bodhicitta and want that mind to grow and develop because it's the main impetus for the full development into Buddhahood for ourselves and others. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And we make prayers for our precious teachers. Again, same thoughts of having them having good health and long lives, all of our spiritual guides having these results from what we're dedicating here, so we and others can continue to have perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Rinpoche, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjuna's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally for Osalhita, Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors, for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And finally, just dedicate quickly for those who are you're holding in your heart right now, those who are experiencing illness or obstacles, who are dying or who have died. Send this positive energy out to those beings so they can be free from their suffering and find all the causes that will lead them to perfect happiness. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. So thank you all for joining in tonight. I enjoyed this a lot. I feel bad that we only have one more class, but we're going to go on to the Heart Sutra. So it'll be a similar type of thing, but just working more focused on that text. So that'll be in the new year that we'll do that. And keep in mind, I think it was in the box, the chat box, but Lama Tsongkhapa Day is tomorrow. We commemorate Lama Tsongkhapa, who is an amazing scholar. I've cited him here and there in terms of some of the texts. And we'll be doing that by having a puja tomorrow night. The Geshe Sherab will be leading meeting Lama Tsongkhapa. So that'll be at 7 o'clock. And I hope you can join for that. I'll be here for that. So, all right. Thank you all so much. And I will definitely see you next week and hopefully see you before then. Be well. Stay safe.